Reason and Revolution by Herbert Marcuse. Part 2, The Rise of Social Theory. Chapter 2.2, The Foundations of Positivism and the Rise of Sociology. Saint Simon. Saint Simon, like Hegel, begins with the assertion that the social order engendered by the French Revolution proved that mankind had reached the adult stage. In contrast to Hegel, however, he described this stage primarily in terms of its economy. The industrial process was the sole integrating factor in the new social order. Like Hegel, again, Saint Simon was convinced that this new order contains the reconciliation of the idea and reality. Humans or human potentialities are no longer the concern of theory apart from practice. The content of theory has been transferred to a plane of rational activity carried on by individuals in direct association with one another. Politics, morals, and philosophy, instead of terminating in leisurely contemplation detached from practice, have eventually arrived at their veritable occupation, namely, to create social happiness. In a word, they are ready to realize that liberty is no longer an abstraction, nor society a fiction. The process of realizing this is an economic one. The new era is that of industrialism, which brings with it a guarantee that it can fulfill all human potentialities. Society as a whole is based on industry. Industry is the only guarantor of its existence and the unique source of all wealth and prosperity. The state of affairs which is most favorable to industry is, therefore, most favorable to society. This is the starting point as well as the goal of all our efforts. The progress of economic conditions necessitates that philosophy pass into social theory, and the social theory is none other than political economy or the science of production. At first, Saint Simon contented himself with proclaiming the principles of radical liberalism. Individuals had been set free in order that they might work, while society was the natural integer that sewed their independent efforts into a harmonious whole. Government was an evil necessary to cope with the danger of anarchy and revolution that lurk behind the mechanisms of industrial capitalism. Saint Simon began with a predominantly optimistic view of industrial society. The rapid progress of all productive forces, he thought, would soon blot out the growing antagonisms and the revolutionary upheavals within this social system. The new industrial order was above all a positive one, representing the affirmation and fruition of all human endeavor for a happy and abundant life. It was not necessary to go beyond the given. Philosophy and social theory needed but to understand and organize the facts. Truth was to be derived from the facts and from them alone. Saint Simon thus became the founder of modern positivism. Social theory, Saint Simon held, would use the same method that is employed in the other sciences of observation. In other words, reasoning must be based upon the facts observed and discussed, instead of following the method adopted by the speculative sciences, which refer all facts to reasoning. Astronomy, physics, and chemistry had already been established on this positive basis. The time had now come for philosophy to join these special sciences and make itself entirely positive. Saint Simon promulgated this positivism as the ultimate principle of his philosophy. In all portions of my work, I shall be occupied with establishing series of facts, for I am convinced that this is the only solid part of our knowledge. Theology and metaphysics, and moreover all transcendental concepts and values, were to be tested by the positivistic method of exact science. Once all our knowledge is uniformly founded on observations, the direction of our spiritual affairs must be trusted to the power of positive science. The science of man, another name for social theory, thus was launched on the pattern of a natural science. It had to be impressed with a positive character by founding it on observation and by treating it with the method employed by the other branches of physics. Society was to be treated like nature. This attitude involved the sharpest deviation from and opposition to Hegel's philosophic theory. The interest of freedom was removed from the sphere of the individual's rational will and set in the objective laws of the social and economic process. Marx considered society to be irrational and hence evil, so long as it continued to be governed by inexorable objective laws. Progress to him was equivalent to upsetting these laws, an act that was to be consummated by man in his free development. The positivist theory of society followed the opposite tendency. The laws of society increasingly received the form of natural objective laws. Men are mere instruments before the omnipotent law of progress, incapable of changing or charting its course. The deification of progress into an independent natural law was completed in Comte's positive philosophy. St. Simon's own work did contain elements that ran counter to the tendencies of industrial capitalism. According to him, the progress of the industrial system presupposed that the struggle between classes was first transformed and diverted into a struggle against nature, in which all the social classes joined. The form of government he envisaged was not one in which rulers command their subjects, but one in which the government exercises a technical administration over the work to be done. We might say that St. Simon's philosophy developed in just the reverse way to Hegel's. It began with the reconciliation of idea and reality and ended by viewing them as irreconcilable. Economic crises and class struggles intensified in France as the Revolution of 1830 approached. By 1826, it was evident that the nation and the monarchy were moving in opposite directions. The monarch was preparing to establish a despotism, while the nation was drifting toward revolution. The lectures that St. Simon's pupil, Bazard, gave in these years on his master's doctrine turned it into a radical critique of the existing social order. Bazard's presentation holds to the basic assumption that philosophy must be made identical with social theory, that society is conditioned by the structure of its economic process, and that rational social practice alone will eventually produce a genuine social form oriented to human needs. The given form of society is no longer adequate to progress and harmony as far as Bazard is concerned. He stigmatizes the industrial system as one of exploitation, as the last, but by far not the least example of the exploitation of man by man, which has run the gamut of civilization's history. In all its relations, the industrial system is molded by the inevitable struggle between the proletariat on the one hand and the owners of the instruments and machinery of production on the other. The whole mass of workers is today exploited by those whose property it utilizes. The entire weight of this exploitation falls upon the working class, that is, upon the immense majority who are workers. Under such conditions, the worker has become the direct descendant of the slave and the serf. He is, as a person, free, and no longer attached to the soil, but this is all the freedom he has got. He can exist in this state of legal freedom only under the conditions imposed upon him by the small class, which a legislation born of the right to conquest has invested with the monopoly of wealth, with the power to command the instruments of labor at will and at leisure. St. Simon's positivism was thus turned into its opposite. Its original conclusions had glorified liberalism, but it now knew that the system underlying this liberalism holds within it the seed of its own destruction. Bazard showed, as Sismondi had before him, that the accumulation of wealth and the spread of poverty, with their attendant crises and growing exploitations, follow from the economic organization in which the capitalists and proprietors are the ones to arrange the social distribution of labor. Every individual is left to his own devices in the process of production, and no common interest or collective effort exists to combine and administer the multitude of works. When the instruments of labor are utilized by isolated individuals subject to the rule of chance and the fact of power, Industrial crises are made inevitable. The social order then, Bazard said, has become general disorder as a result of the principle of unlimited competition. Progressive ideas like the ones with which capitalist society justified its social scheme at the beginning, ideas of general freedom and of the pursuit of happiness within a rational scheme of life, can reach fruition only with a new revolution that will finally do away with the exploitation of man by man in all its insidious forms. That revolution is inevitable, and until it is consummated, all the glowing phrases so oft repeated about the light of civilization and the glory of the century will remain mere language for the convenience of privileged egoists. The institution of private property will have to come to an end. For if exploitation is to disappear, the scheme of property by which exploitation is perpetuated must also disappear. The doctrine Saint-Simonian reflects the social upheavals caused by the progress of industrialism under the Restoration. During this period, machines were introduced on an ever larger scale, especially in the textile mills, and industry began to concentrate. However, France experienced not only the industrial and commercial growth which St. Simon's early writings extol, but the reverse of this as well. Costly crises shook the entire system in 1816 to 17 and in 1825 to 27. Workers banded together to destroy the machines that caused them so much misery and unemployment. There could be no doubt that the rise of large-scale industry had an unfavorable influence on the condition of the worker. Agrarian home labor suffered from factory competition. The introduction of machines rendered cheap female and child labor possible, and these in turn served to depress wages. Migration to the cities created a scarcity of housing facilities, and this condition, together with a general lack of proper food, made for a breeding ground of rickets and tuberculosis. Epidemics like the cholera epidemic of 1832 took their toll, particularly among workers. Misery fosters dipsomania and prostitution. Industrial centers have a mortality far above the average, especially among children. Government intervened with repressive measures against workers. The Lex Le Chapelier of 1789 had prohibited organization of workers. Strikes were now answered with a call of the army. Leaders were given lengthy prison sentences. Increasing restrictions were placed on the freedom of workers. While pledging the entire power of the state against the workers, the authorities are extremely lenient with the entrepreneurs. In 1829, the ship owners of Grenouille associated themselves for the purpose of lowering the wages of their seamen. The judiciary and the Ministry of the Navy declared their procedure contrary to law, but refused any legal action because they feared that the seamen would be driven to rebellion. Occurrences like these made it obvious that the economic process or factors in it reached its tentacles into the totality of social relations and held them in grip. Smith and Ricardo had treated this economic process as a specialized science, where wealth, poverty, labor, value, property, and all its other paraphernalia appeared as strictly economic conditions and relations to be derived from or explained by economic laws. St. Simon had made the economic laws the foundation of the whole process of society. Now, when his socialist successors in France were building social theory on an economic base, they were changing the conceptual character of political economy. It ceased to be a pure and specialized science, becoming instead an intellectual force for exposing the antagonisms of the modern social structure and for guiding action in the direction of resolving them. By the same token, the commodity world ceased to be conceived in terms of its own reification. When Sismondi, for instance, argued against Ricardo that political economy is not a science of calculus, but a moral science, He was not advocating a regress from scientific to moral criteria in reasoning, but was indicating that the focus of economic theory should be upon human wants and desires. Sismondi's statement belongs in the last analysis with the tendency that operated in Hegel when he gave to social theory a philosophic construction. Hegel was getting at the point that society, which was the historical stage in the self-development of men, had to be interpreted as the totality of human relations, and this with an eye to its role in advancing the realization of reason and freedom. It was precisely this philosophic interpretation of social theory that turned the latter into a critical theory of political economy. For, as soon as it was viewed in the light of reason and freedom, the prevailing form of society appeared as a complex of economic contradictions that bred an irrational and enslaved order. Because the philosophic interpretation of society carried the critical implications that it did, any disjunction between philosophy and social theory was held to weaken these critical motives, which pushed philosophical concepts to see beyond and to go beyond the given state of affairs. Proudhon saw the reason for the apologetic conclusions of economic theory and its consequent frustration of any principle of action to consist in the separation of philosophy from political economy. Philosophy, he said, is the algebra of society, and political economy is the application of this algebra. Philosophy to him, then, was the theory of reason. Following out this beginning, Proudhon defined social theory as the accord between reason and social practice. And in stating the subject matter of social theory, he placed great stress on its comprehensive area of application. It deals with the entire life of society, with the ensemble of its successive manifestations, thus reaching far beyond the range of the special science of economics. Emphasis on the philosophic nature of social theory, however, does not attenuate the importance of its economic foundation. Quite the contrary, such emphasis would expand the scope of economic theory beyond the limits of a specialized science. The laws of economy are the laws of history, Proudhon says. The new political economy was quite different from the classical objective science of Adam Smith and Ricardo. It differed from this in that it showed the economy to be contradictory and irrational throughout its structure, with crisis as its natural state and revolution as its natural end. Sismondi's work, the first thoroughgoing imminent critique of capitalism, amply illustrates the contrast. It held to the criterion of a truly critical theory of society. We shall take society in its actual organization, with its workers deprived of poverty, their wages fixed by competition, their labor dismissed by their masters as soon as they no longer have need of it, for it is to this very social organization that we object. All forms of social organization, Sismondi declared, exist to gratify human wants. The prevailing economic system does so under continuous crisis and growing poverty amid accumulating wealth. Sismondi laid bare the mechanisms of early industrial capitalism that led to this result. The necessity of recurring crises, he stated, is a consequence of the impact of capital on the productive process. The increasing exploitation and the persistent disproportion between production and consumption are consequence of the system of commodity exchange. Sismondi went on to sketch the hidden relations behind exchange value and use value and the various forms for appropriating surplus value. He demonstrated the connection between the concentration of capital, overproduction, and crisis. Through the concentration of wealth among a small number of proprietors, the internal market continued to shrink and industry is ever increasingly compelled to sell on external markets where even greater concussions threaten. Free competition falls far short of giving full development to all productive capacities and to the greatest satisfaction of human needs. It brings wholesale exploitation and repeated destruction of the sources of wealth. To be sure, capitalism brought immense progress to society, but the advance resulted in a constant increase in the working population and in a labor supply that usually surpassed the demand. The economic mechanisms of commodity production is responsible for these antagonisms. Were the tendencies of the system given their full expression, the result would be to transform the nation into a huge factory that, far from creating wealth, would cause general misery. Only 6 years after St. Simon had inaugurated positivism, social theory gave this radical refutation to the social order by which he had justified the new philosophy. The system of industry was seen as the system of capitalist exploitation. The doctrine of harmonious equilibrium was replaced by the doctrine of inherent crisis. The idea of progress was given a new meaning. Economic progress did not necessarily mean human progress. Under capitalism, progress is made at the expense of freedom and reason. Sismondi repudiated the philosophy of progress, together with the entire panoply of optimistic glorification. He called upon the state to exert its protective authority in the interest of the oppressed mass. The fundamental dogma of free and general competition has made great strides in all civilized societies. It has resulted in a prodigious development of industrial power, but it has also brought terrifying distress for most classes of the population. Experience has taught us the need for the protective authority of government, needed lest men be sacrificed for the advancement of a wealth from which they will derive no benefit. Only a short decade after the publication of Sismondi's work, social philosophy fell back upon the dogma of progress, and characteristically enough, relinquished political economy as foundational for social theory. Comte's positive philosophy ushered in this regress. We shall deal with it now.